Chapter 28 The Audience. Lady Genevieve led her swiftly up the steeply winding stairs. The path was more complicated than it had been below, the platforms of the library interweaving this way and that, each branching out to their own diverging passages and stairs, until very soon Kendra would have been quite lost. Fortunately, her guide was utterly assured of herself, effortlessly picking out her path. Adrian followed close behind the witch, but now and then he would turn back to Kendra with a reassuring look, as if he could feel her anxiety. Perhaps he could. Before long, they turned down a small side passage off of what appeared to be a cross between a smithy and a reference library, and came to a small, unassuming door. Lady Genevieve smoothly rotated concentric stone discs inlaid into the wall in a pattern that made some sort of sense to her, and there was a loud click from the door. The witch stepped in, and with the barest beckon, instructed Kendra to follow. Kendra was not entirely sure what she had expected to find. A throne room, perhaps, or a chamber of brewing cauldrons and strange vapors. The truth, as it turned out, was jarringly mundane. She stepped into a small parlor of polished brass furnishings, covered with comfortable and unremarkable pillows and blankets that took the edge off the cold metal. Natural sunlight poured in pleasantly from a window above. It was unexpectedly homey, with a few exceptions. There were, unsurprisingly, bookshelves pushed high against each wall, laden with peculiar and mystifying items beside row upon row of worn tomes. Some unidentifiable ridge of taut canvas peeked over the top of one such shelf. Everything was meticulously clean, as if attended to by a staff of aggressive maids, and the ceiling was extremely high. A small spiral stairwell led to the open-air lofts above, which stood across from an odd series of criss-crossing metal bars. It was once again strangely reminiscent of a bird-cage. A small chill ran through her as it occurred to her that she was very much as trapped as her friends. "Sit," the witch called, breaking Kendra from her trance. She had passed around a corner while Kendra had been distracted, and there was a sound of splashing water, a few murmured words, and the sudden musical whistling of a kettle. Kendra hastily got into a spindly chair at the table, folding her hands into her lap, carefully willing her face to a politely neutral expression. Calm, courteous, ladylike, she reminded herself. She had never been much good at such social niceties, in spite of her aunt's stringent efforts. It was difficult to be ingratiating with a face like hers. But now, as she reflected on Boris, Maya, and Caleb, suspended in cages somewhere far below, she could not afford any of her usual blunders. She steeled herself and waited. Genevieve was back moments later, teapot in hand. Trailing a few steps behind her came Adrian, absently holding a tray of teacups at a precarious angle. Genevieve set herself across the table from Kendra, surveying her with the confident, analytical gaze of a frank merchant at her scales. Tucked evenly between them at his own corner of the table, Adrian hopped into a seat as well, the teacups dropping to the table with a clatter. He tucked his knees close to his chest and watched them both, his eyes flickering back and forth. Kendra held her breath, waiting carefully for her inspection to be concluded. Finally, Lady Genevieve broke the silence. "So, who are you, exactly? Why are you here?" The words seemed deceptively disinterested, but her eyes were bright and keen. Kendra took a deep and shaky breath, but when she spoke, She was relieved to hear it came clear and concise. "I am Kendra Aberth, at your service, my lady. I am here to deliver news and to ask for aid." The witch shook her head dismissively. "That does not tell me what I need to know. You are here because of who you are, and I believe that you are someone very strange indeed. Explain yourself. Who or what are you?" She blinked, caught off balance. "Strange, my lady? I'm really not anyone special." An impatient scoff cut her off. "No ordinary person would be sitting with me now. If you were ordinary, you would be in a cage down with the rest of them. But my servants didn't pick you up. They ignored you. By that alone you are strange, without even bringing up the company you arrive in." At this, her eyes flashed and her mouth tightened. "What is your significance in all this?" For a moment, Kendra was utterly paralyzed, desperately searching for something else to say, some way to take the edge off the answer she knew was needed. But this was why she came, she reminded herself harshly. She looked up, shoulders squared with pained resolve. "I am the one that killed the Hair Familiar." The witch went rigid as a lightning-struck tower, eyes crackling, and for just a moment Kendra saw something truly terrible brewing. Then she slumped back into her chair. "You're a human, aren't you?" she asked tiredly. The look of surprise on Kendra's face was apparently answer enough. "Don't be so shocked. It's a simple matter of deduction. The one who killed Keenan must have wielded a weapon of iron, and such things are not kept within the garden. That makes you an outsider. I assumed you were fairy folk of some sort when I saw those ears, but that's not it, is it? You ate him, didn't you?" Kendra tried and failed to speak, then merely nodded. "That's why my servants didn't stop you," Genevieve explained without interest, her mind clearly caught in other considerations. "They don't interfere with our magics, and our magics are within you now. In you and—" There was a sharp intake of breath. "You have something of mine, don't you?" Kendra sat numbly in her chair, quaking as the storm of a woman rose, towering over her. "I don't know what you mean," she said hastily. "I would never—" "You killed Keenan, my sister's familiar, an ancient creature older and nobler than you can imagine. My friend, my family. But you're also a thief? You took one of my books, you dreadful little swine! Admit it!" There was a crackle in the air, and the sunlight suddenly seemed muted and dull as the furious witch reached across the table to where Kendra sat, trembling. There was a blur of movement, and suddenly the murderous rumbling ceased. The sunlight returned to its normal hue, bright and cheerful, as if nothing had happened. Adrian was on his feet now, his expression melancholy, his hand stretched to grab Genevieve's arm. Both women turned to him, staring in stunned disbelief. Then, after several tense moments, Genevieve collapsed once again back into her own seat, weary, but still with a truly black look for Kendra. "It seems you have even turned my own familiar against me," she said bitterly. "You certainly have a gift for ruining things, Kendra Aberth." "It's been said," Kendra admitted dully. She could not meet the witch's eyes. They saw too much, and she could not bear to see what was reflected there. Instead, She rooted around in her pack until she found the tome from the living city. Another piece fell into place in her mind. "I think this must be yours," she said smallly, pushing the book across the table. "I didn't steal it from you, I promise. I found it, and I'm sorry." Lady Genevieve picked up the journal suspiciously, then flicked through it with growing confusion. Abruptly, she rose from the table and stomped off to a nearby bookshelf, where she kneeled down to a blank spot on the bottom. She stared at it for so long that Kendra began to fidget, her stomach squirming. She had almost decided to break the silence when the Witch of Words turned back to her, face stony and unreadable, and returned to her seat. Silently, she poured 2 cups of tea, pushed one towards Kendra, and began to unscrew a small jar. "Do you want any sugar?" she inquired tersely. Kendra shook her head nervously, and the witch growled. "Oh, don't be that way. Have a lump." Kendra glanced to Adrian for a sign, who had returned to his relaxed posture of waiting, peeking at them in turn from behind his knees. The witch's turbulent wrath only just before seemed to distress him not at all. She supposed that that was good enough, and nodded her acceptance. "Thank you," she said, extending her cup warily. With an ill-graced plop, the witch dropped a cube into the offered drink, then took a long sip of her own. She was no longer staring at Kendra, seemingly lost in her own thoughts. "It would seem that you are not the only one who has something to be sorry for," she said, her gaze distant. "Whatever else you are responsible for, you are not a thief. I owe you an apology for that accusation. I am sorry." "It's fine, no harm done," Kendra replied hastily. "I'd say that I'm sorry too, but it seems a little trite, in the face of what's happened, the harm I've done. It doesn't make anything better, doesn't fix anything." She clamped her jaw shut. She couldn't afford to dig her grave any deeper. Maya needed her. They all did. "But if it means anything at all, I truly am sorry. I didn't know what it was, what he was." Keenan. Somehow a name made it all worse. Genevieve huffed. "You are correct, unfortunately. It doesn't make anything better, but it's still right of you to say it." She paused, taking another sip. Her voice had been almost sympathetic for a moment, but when she spoke, all trace of softness was gone. "As for fixing things, I don't imagine anything can. You can't give back the life you took, but there are things I'll ask of you nevertheless." Kendra felt that weight, the one that had pressed on her ever more as she had learned in the last weeks the full extent of her mistakes. But for a brief moment, as she filled with purpose and direction, they did not feel crushing. Almost eagerly, she nodded her assent. "Anything that I can do, I will, Lady Genevieve," she pledged. "Good," the witch said, mild in spite of the immense tiredness in her eyes. For the first time, Kendra noticed the bags that were cut into the woman's cheeks. "The most important thing you can do will be to come with me now. We need to see my sister." "Of course, my lady," she replied, a little more loudly than was required. She hoped it would cover the tremor that had gone through her at hearing the plan. One angry witch had been more than sufficiently intimidating. Considering seeking out a second was borderline terrifying. But Kendra swallowed those fears, mostly.
Why exactly are we going? I mean to say, what do you want to accomplish by me going with you? If it's a matter of taking personal responsibility, I'll do it, but I'd like to know."
There was an uncomfortable silence as Genevieve looked at her levelly, weighing her. "Do you know why a witch has a familiar?" she finally asked. Kendra frowned. In truth, lore on witches was scarce in her readings. They were generally reclusive figures, usually dancing at the edge of myth.
"I never came across much in the way of primary sources in my studies," she admitted uncomfortably. "Various religious orders generally said that a familiar is the witch's link with demonic powers, but they say that about a lot of things. The Order of the Three Holy Roses maintains that drinking certain varieties of herbal tea on a full moon is similarly fraught, so I tend to take their commentaries with a grain of salt." She was a bit taken aback by her own daring, but the question was oddly nostalgic. It somehow harkened back to the days at home, trying to impress her tutors, and if she was not mistaken, she caught a glimmer of a smile tugging at Genevieve's lips. She cleared her throat and continued, more concisely. "In truth, I don't know much. My understanding is that there's little serious scholarship on the subject, or at least it's not available today. If I were to speculate broadly, I would assume that familiars are in some way useful to your magic."
"So you're not entirely unread," the witch mused. "That's good. One of the most dangerous qualities of humanity is its propensity for confidence in spite of ignorance. A curious and questioning mind is a laudable thing." Kendra nodded, trying her best to conceal her pleasure at the praise. "Well," Genevieve went on, "it is a complicated subject. It deals with the nature of magic. I don't know if you are aware of this, but all witches, great and small throughout history, have been humans."
"How is that possible?" Kendra asked, disbelief slipping into her voice. "I mean, aren't you at least—" She scanned her mind, thinking of references to the garden in historical texts. "At least 3,000 years old?" she finally finished. In spite of her serious demeanor, Genevieve gave a brief chuckle. "At least," she said dryly, "but that is the product of magic, not my nature. There are many ways to extend one's lifetime if you are sufficiently skilled and knowledgeable, almost indefinitely. It's one of the first things you learn as you delve into the power of the fairy folk, and no one is able to touch that power, the power of magic, quite in the way that a witch can." "But aren't the fairy folk, well, magic by nature?" Kendra objected tentatively. "That's what makes them fairy folk. How can a human be more in touch with that power than they are?" If she hadn't known better, Kendra would have said the witch was almost enjoying herself. "Ah," Genevieve said, her thin, almost smile condescending. "You are well studied, aren't you? Well, Kendra Aberth, let me ask you this. Can you see your own face?" Kendra paused, flummoxed. "I know what my face looks like," she said slowly and carefully. "I've seen reflections of it, and heard people describe it." Long habit found her fingering the elaborate burns. She'd heard more than her share of people describing that. "True enough," Lady Genevieve agreed, her air of open superiority unabated. "But you cannot directly observe it. It is a part of you, and therefore your source of knowledge is secondary. It's too close to you. Only an outsider can have direct knowledge of such things, and so it is with magic as well. Fairy folk have an intuitive magical understanding, but they are part of the pattern. There are many things they take for granted, because it is all second nature to them. There are many great mages and scholars among them, certainly,
but they are hard-pressed indeed to match the mastery of a fully recognized witch. Kendra sat at rapt attention, her eyes shining. In her studies, magic had always been one of the great unexplored phenomena. It was demonstrably real, but it defied attempts at measurement or testing, and was only rarely encountered by humans in the modern day. She could have stayed and asked more questions for hours, were it not for the thought of her friends in cages far below. "Pardon my asking," she interjected during a small lull in the explanation, "but what does this have to do with familiars?" Lady Genevieve paused, seemingly a bit put out. "Well, yes, I suppose we ought to cut to the point," she admitted, and the solemn edge crept back into her voice. "Because witches are human, we aren't designed as conduits of magic, not in the way that fairy folk are. Their bodies and minds are fundamentally physiologically different from our own. They have limitations and safeguards that humans simply aren't born with. In a sense, a witch is mighty because she can exceed those limits. But those limits exist for a good reason." A dark look flickered across her face, some shadow of unhappy memory, before she went on gravely. "Humans who use magic must pay a toll for their transgressions. We are still children of iron, and magic is anathema to us. Eventually, it destroys anyone who wields it." With a gentle gesture, Genevieve pushed a few strands of hair from Adrian's face. He returned her look, watchful and protective. "That's where familiars come in," she said tenderly. "If the weight of the power is redistributed, if another mind, naturally attuned to magic, can take some of the burden, then a witch can use magic in relative safety. It's no simple process. It involves a powerful pact and a joining of souls. If your will is insufficient or your bond too weak, it might destroy both parties. But should you succeed, the power that is granted can be nothing short of extraordinary. All of this, our entire garden, is the result of the two unions between witch and familiar." A chill ran down Kendra's spine. "And with one of those familiars gone, what happens then?" she asked, caught between not wanting to know and an insatiable curiosity. For the first time, Genevieve did not look Kendra in the eye, sipping her tea with a distant, almost haunted expression. "Madness," she said eventually, her voice flat and grim. "A witch who loses her familiar will begin to lose her mind." Kendra felt her heart sink. Another life to be lost on her account? "Surely there's something that can be done?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "I mean, you still have Adrian. Can't you use your magic to help her?" Genevieve sighed, crestfallen and weary, and Kendra felt another pang of guilt. It looked as if the witch hadn't slept through a night in weeks. "It's theoretically possible," she admitted. "All Ilia needs to do is make a new pact with a new magical being. It's not the most straightforward ritual, but she should be able to do it. She's done it before. But in order to do it, she'd have to accept that Keenan is gone." Kendra gripped her teacup tightly, but she found that she couldn't quite feel her fingers. "That's where I come in," she concluded numbly. "You want me to tell her what I did, to show her what I've become." More than ever before, the long hare's ears atop her head felt alien and wrong, one more mistake on the twisted little shell that was her body. Genevieve was holding Adrian's hand now, and her proud features had turned almost apologetic.
"You must understand," she said quietly. "We have shared our minds and souls with our familiars for millennia. 2 weeks ago, Ilya and I lost our connections one after another. Under normal circumstances, I can feel Adrian, wherever he is in the garden, even if only a bit of his mood. To have that connection suddenly severed, it was terrifying. We both feared the worst. I think that between Keenan's death and meeting you, who carries his essence, the shock was too much for Adrian. He adapted himself, perhaps unconsciously, to the closest source of familiar comfort he could find, to you. He left his natural form and took on a human shape, and I don't know if he remembers how to turn back." She watched Adrian with furrowed brow, longing burning achingly in her eyes. "Even now, as close as this, I barely recognize him. Of course," she continued heavily, "at a certain point, I realized that at least Adrian was alive. Ilya and I searched and searched, bent all our power on finding them, and nothing turned up. But my magic and my mind were as stable as ever." "But your sister, she—" Kendra searched uncomfortably for delicate phrasing. "She isn't stable?" Genevieve pursed her lips reluctantly. "She's become, well, temperamental," she said, even now slightly defensive. "That inclement weather outside, you might call it a reflection of her state of mind. The eye of the storm, that is her eye. She swept in the focus of her search from the outer edges of the garden all the way down into the calm within, but there's nothing to find anymore. Her eye has certainly passed over you, but we were looking for Keenan, not you." A look of sudden helplessness flashed across the witch's face, and to Kendra that was the most unnerving thing yet in their exchange. "I tried to tell her," she said miserably. "I tried to suggest that it could only mean he was gone, that she was getting worse, that she needed to make a new pact, and quickly. But she wouldn't hear it. She got angry, violent, forced me out of her citadel." There was a raw, throaty edge to the admission, and Kendra knew that this powerful and ancient myth of a woman was choking back tears. "All right," Kendra replied, deliberately practical. "How much time do we have? Before she gets worse, and the damage becomes irreversible. We need a plan." She felt callous, but she couldn't fall apart now. Purpose was called for. She could feel her own panic bubbling up, and talking about solutions kept Kendra steady, kept her from imagining the witch of the wilds, this Ilya, anguished and half mad with grief. "Will you be able to make her hear you out this time?" "There's no way of knowing," Genevieve said, taken aback. "There's never been a witch as powerful as Ilya in recorded history. My abilities are formidable, but my sister, she's something special. Her will is strong, but the magic that she's channeling is just as potent. I don't know how long her mind can last, but I will do everything in my power to put a stop to this before it's too late." She paused, suddenly hesitant. "You'll help me, Kendra Aberth?" Kendra looked over to Adrian, who was still perched quietly in his chair. He was composed, but there was a clear anxiety in his eyes that said that he understood them fully, that he knew the stakes, and looked on as the future of what remained of his little family balanced now on the edge of oblivion. Fear gnawed at her gut to think of standing before Ilya, the woman that she had so grievously wounded without ever knowing it. But it was more painful still to think
even for a moment, that she might abandon Adrian to this nightmare of her creation. Reaching out to him, she gave his hand a squeeze and met his eyes as she swallowed her guilt with a ragged little smile. "I'll do whatever I can to help," she responded firmly, directing her words to Genevieve without looking away. With a shaky breath, the witch rose. "Then there's no time to lose," she said, suddenly brisk again. "The bridge between the citadels isn't far. It will take some time to make it through her domain. It was always a little rough for my tastes, and I expect it will be rather less hospitable than usual. Come, quickly." "Wait," Kendra blurted. She had been rising obediently to follow when she remembered suddenly. "My friends, they're, well, still in your cages." "Oh, them," Lady Genevieve said dismissively. "They're perfectly safe where they are. Obviously, I wouldn't actually order them to be crushed. Well," she amended, "not without good cause. But for now, they'd just get in the way. Now, forget that foolishness. We must hurry." She was halfway out of the room when she realized that Kendra had not moved. "My friend Maya, she came a long way to see you. I wouldn't have even gotten here without her help. I can't just leave her now. You have to hear her out." Genevieve's look was a shard of ice in the gut. "What did you say?" "I mean to say, she really needs to speak to you, my lady," Kendra revised hastily, trying not to squeak. In truth, she could not believe she was arguing with the witch, but this was her last chance. There was no guarantee that when all was done, Genevieve would grant a second audience. For that matter, it seemed far from certain that Kendra would be alive to remind her. "It's important," she added a little desperately. "Please." The witch's fist clenched. She inspected Kendra coolly enough, but there was a murderous glint in her eye. Kendra held her breath as she watched the assessment take her in. The inspection turned to Adrian, who had not moved, still curled calm and impassive in his seat beside Kendra. Finally, Genevieve exhaled with a hiss, her hand unclenching, and Kendra could breathe again, trying not to look as terrified as she felt. "No one has dared give me an order in my own kitchen before," Genevieve said through gritted teeth. "You will not do so again." She glared, before gesturing in a manner that was violent, but also prompting. "Well, aren't you going to tell me what's so infernally important?" Half stumbling over her words in her haste to comply, Kendra launched into her explanation of Maya's story. Genevieve stood stiffly against the door, her arms crossed and her posture forbidding, but as the tale unfolded, she began to lean forward intently. Her eyes flickered in agitation as Kendra spoke of the terrible fate of the dwarves, and when Kendra got to the culprit and its relentless pursuit, she thought she saw the witch flinch. "The Black House," Genevieve said urgently. "You're sure they were living in the Black House? The great dome at the center of the garden?" "That's where I found them," Kendra confirmed. "Maya told me there were hundreds of dwarves that lived there once, but the face stealer did something to them." She shuddered at the memory. "I met them again, under the Hill of the Lost," she said, and she realized her voice had shrank to a whisper. "Or at least, I met some part of them there. I mean, I saw their bodies back then, so they can't just be dead, exactly. Or, I don't know. Even the specters had lost their faces." She gasped as she felt a bump against her shoulder. Adrian had risen silently and was leaning against her, eyes large with concern. She realized that she was trembling, as if the dread of the pit was reaching out to pull her back down. With a shake of her head, Kendra pushed the memories from her mind and continued.
Anyway, that's what I know. We tried to do some research in the living city, but we couldn't find anything in the library of the elves about a face stealer.
The witch's expression was utterly inscrutable, but for a long time she was silent, deep in her own counsels.
When did you first encounter this thing, this face stealer of yours? She finally asked, deadly serious. Well, that was the night I passed over the river, Kendra said uneasily. It took the face of one of my friends and attacked our camp. It happened right after I met Adrian.
For the first time, the coincidence of it sunk in.
Why? She asked with growing urgency. Do you know what that monster is?
Lady Genevieve did not reply. She was moving quickly, pulling a deep purple knit scarf off a stand, along with a strange cap with goggles set into the leather.
The plan has changed, she said shortly,
bustling about and stuffing things into a rucksack.
You will have to start on your own to see my sister. Tell her what she must know. You can make it. The bridge isn't far now. And I suppose that I must release those people below us. They may be of some help to you now.
She gave an off-handed wave.
I will be back as quickly as I can. With luck, I will meet you as you arrive to meet my sister.
She paused in her cyclone of preparations, stepping in close to Adrian and pulling him into a tight embrace. As she did, her face slipped for a moment, softer and lined with worry. After a few moments she pulled back, but one hand remained entwined in his hair, held between them as a solemn oath. Her lips were moving furiously, but Kendra could hear nothing until suddenly the wind outside began to buffet the tower. At the same time, both Genevieve and Adrian sagged noticeably. Finally, wiping her brow, Genevieve began to shuffle towards the back of her kitchen.
"Please, wait!" Kendra exclaimed. "I don't understand. What changed? Where are you going? What does the face stealer have to do with this?"
She swallowed her next question as that sharp gaze turned on her.
"There is something I must check," the witch replied, carefully level. "Perhaps everything is as it seems. There are many strange and ancient beings in this world, and even I do not know them all."
But she spoke with the air of one trying to convince herself. Shaking her head, she slid the thick journal back to Kendra.
"Take this now. It seems to have led you this far, as remarkable as that may be. I never did think anyone could follow my writing. It should guide you true enough."
"Thank you," Kendra said, automatic and uncomprehending. The witch snorted, then pulled the great something off the top of the high bookshelf. It folded delicately, but taut canvas was clearly visible over some sturdy lattice. The thing was bulky, but Genevieve hefted it effortlessly. At the back of the quarters, she tossed open a large window, spilling wind into the room with a roar. Then, with the look of one remembering a triviality, she turned back a last time.
"Kendra Aberth?" "Yes?" "Do keep Adrian safe. If anything were to happen to him, that would mean he won't be there to stop me next time. I promise you, you would suffer greatly before you died."
Kendra flinched away. Those eyes that burned into her were humorless, unforgiving, and absolutely inescapable. Then she was gone. Kendra gasped as she watched Genevieve fall intentionally from the window, but only a moment later a dark shape swooped back up, stark against the evening sky. The bundle of canvas had unfurled into broad wings, catching the howling currents of air that whirled around the citadel. Riding on the wind, the Witch of Words slipped rapidly away into the distance, flying north into the storm.